Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
I don't remember if I told you this. It was a note that I had in my file, and I forgot if I told you about it. Did I mention to you the Jewish annotated New Testament?
Yes, that's Adele Berlin's? No, someone else's.
Oh, no, Amy Jill Levine and Mark.
Yeah, you did.
Yes. Anyway, so regarding Matthew 27:25, his blood be on us and upon our children. So I forgot who the exact editor and commentator, because they have different ones, but the Jewish scholar commenting on the book of Matthew made the following very reasonable assessment of that, what that really means. He said the verse reflects the point of view of the author of Matthew and the readers post 70 CE. And from that perspective, the first generation was directly responsible for the death of Jesus. The second generation was punished by the destruction of the temple. And that's it. And so the person writing it had in mind those two generations. And that's why it says on us and upon our children, because he already knew that the temple was destroyed, which of course was a sign of God's anger. And being a Christian, he would say it's a sign of God's anger because of the rejection of Jesus. So that's I thought that was very reasonable, but we don't know for sure. But it makes sense. All right. We're now going to finish up our beloved friend John Chrysostom. And I remind you that the meaning of the word Chrysostom is golden-mouthed, because he was such a golden-mouthed preacher. And as you've seen, he is a very, very forceful preacher, and creature, apparently. Yes, both. Anyhow. So we're on the second page of the John Chrysostom text that I sent you, Sermon 1, all right? And we have, about 3/4 of the way down, we have passage number 5, all right? And then, sorry, hold on. No, we want to go up to 3, halfway down. And then we said, nothing is more miserable than these people who never fail to attack their own salvation. All right, so now he's going to continue showing how the Jews throughout history have actually been fools when it came to dealing with their relationship with God. Okay, so you can find there about a little bit more than halfway down, you'll see number 3 in the middle. The next line, when there was need. Somebody please read.
I didn't bring the papers. Sorry.
Go ahead.
What?
Please tell me the page again. I'm having trouble with my hand rolling down.
All right, it's the John Chrysostom 8 Homilies Against the Jews is the title at the top. Sermon 1, and you should have in the lower right-hand corner a handwritten number 2.
Oh, got it. Let me get there. I was stuck on 1. Okay.
Right.
But do not be surprised that I called the Jews pitiable.
No. Halfway down, number 3.
Whoops. Number 3.
The line after that. The last 3 words of the line after number 3.
Oh, got it. So,
okay.
Not starting 3. Say it again one more time. Sorry. Oh,
when there was need to observe the law.
Got it. They trampled it underfoot. Now that the law has ceased to bind, they obstinately strive to observe it.
All right. So what does he mean so in other words, when there was need to observe the law, they trampled it underfoot. How do we know that they trampled it underfoot? This is going back to biblical times.
Because of all the prophets saying you did it, you're not listening.
Prophets who said you guys are sinners, right? Okay. But now what does it mean that when he says, now that the law has ceased to bind, they obstinately strive to observe it?
Well, the cease to bind is the idea that, as we said before, circumcision of the heart has replaced actual circumcision. You don't need to do this. You don't need to do that. You don't need to keep the laws. You just need to believe in the new divinity.
Right. That's it. So, but now they obstinately strive to observe it. Now, remember, this sermon is being given to Christians in the church, right? But
what does he mean? What does he mean? They have tried to observe it.
Well, the Jews were pushing for that their synagogue should be allowed to function, people in the synagogue regularly to pray. In other words, the whole notion of, shall we say, the impact of what the rabbis were trying to get people to do slowly was taking over, and people were going to shul, which means they're observing the dietary laws. Living in Antioch, of course, which is a pagan surrounding, there are a lot of Jews who wanted to make sure that they were able to continue and actively fulfilling their obligations to God, which is what you and I would be doing. But he's saying, but now the law, all right, as Tybalt told us, the law is no longer binding because Jesus is here. He's the way to God, not the law. Of course, what Chrysostom is very conveniently overlooking is Paul letter to the Romans, parts 10, 9, and 10 and 11, where Paul says the covenant with the Jews is still in effect. They have to observe it. You guys, Gentiles, don't. So Paul himself said the Jews are supposed to keep observing the covenant. So Chrysostom is, as many propagandists do, taking things out of context or very, blithely ignoring statements in their own tradition and their own source of knowledge that indicate that statement is blatantly wrong. Okay? So, what can I tell you? But there again, you can see the guy is a propagandist. And remember, his target he's talking as if he's talking to the Jews. He says you, right? It's like second person, right? The whole sermon is that way. It's as if the Jews are there in the church, but they're not. Okay, but it's his rhetorical style to make an impact on the people in the church who also want to go to the synagogue. That's his target. He wants to keep them from going to the synagogue. So what he's trying to indicate is what they're witnessing in the synagogue, rather than being a place of God's presence, is the opposite. It's a place where the people are trying to look holy, but are not, because in fact they are dealing with a bogus tradition, because it's now canceled. And so what you see there that impresses you is hollow. When they read from the scroll, which impressed these Christians, right? There's the scroll. That's where God is. So he would say, no, they're reading it, but they're reading something that is no longer operative. And they're using that as the basis for their life. Well, that makes no sense, he's saying, because it's no longer operative. Again, forgetting Paul, who said, yes, it is for the Jews. And the holiness that exists within that, from Paul's perspective, Paul of his later career, not his early career, but where he ended up, he would say, yeah, the Torah that's the word of God. The Jews just don't get it right, but yes, it's the word of God. And that's for them. They have to bear that burden. You guys don't. He says, even I do. He admits. He says at one point, the law has led me to sin, because things that I'm prone to do in the law are defined as being sinful, but I'm tempted and tend to do those things because he was an assimilated Jew. Okay, it's like an observant Jew who goes to shul on Shabbos, but we'll after shul go down the street and get a BLT. That's Paul. Not quite, but you get the analogy. Okay, you, Barbara.
I'm forgetting, is this guy writing before or after Christ has been put up on the cross?
Well, this is 388 CE.
Oh, okay, thank you. I
Yeah.
didn't hear the time.
Yeah, right. No, this is a church father. This is not a contemporary. It's a pagan guy. He has no Jewish roots as far as we know. Okay. All right. So continue. Who was Tybal? What could be more pitiable?
What could be more pitiable than
No,
pitiable?
Yes.
I think it should be than those, but that those who provoke God not only by transgressing the law, but also by keeping it. On this account, Stephen said, "You stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart, you always resist the Holy Spirit, not only by transgressing the law, but also by wishing to observe it at the wrong time."
Right. So he's saying what Stephen said. He said it back then, and now it's still going on. Okay, continue. 5. Now here he's going to explain why does this tendency exist among the Jews. So this go ahead.
But what is the source of this hardness? It comes from gluttony and drunkenness. Who say so? Moses himself. Israel ate and was filled, and the darling grew fat and frisky. When brute animals feed from a full manger, they grow plump and become more obstinate and hard to hold in check. They endure neither the yoke, the reins, nor the hand of the charioteer.
All right, stop. So the Jews here are being compared with brute animals who get fat, right? So those of you who are in the Amos class, remember last night, we talked about that, how the prophet Amos refers to the rich ladies in the town of Samaria who are the cows of Bashan, which means they're big fat ladies, right? And this is the Hebrew prophet talking about other Hebrews. All right, I'm surprised he didn't mention that, but it's the same thing. He's got Moses saying this. So the implication is the Jews are like these brute animals, right? Okay, now continue. When brute animals, you read that, right? So
I think I did that one. I think I'm at just so. So the Jewish.
Wait, stop just a second. So they grow plump and obstinate and hard to hold in check, right? And if you want to put the yoke on them, you can't. They won't listen to work the reins. They won't, and they won't, take the control of a charioteer. They're wild, totally run by their lust for food and drink. Just go ahead now. So
the Jewish people were driven by their drunkenness and plumpness to the ultimate evil. They kicked about, they failed to accept the yoke of Christ, nor did they pull the plow of his teaching.
Wow, okay. And that's but you see, it's in the Jews' physical nature to live this way. And is he talking here racism? It's not. I don't think he talked in those terms. But nonetheless, the implication is this is the nature of the Jew. So in a sense, it's quasi-racial.
But Rabbi, isn't it also a denial of Jews as human beings? Because when you start and plant the idea of this extended comparison to animals, and that animals are supposed to obey. I mean, human beings don't obey in the same way. And even though one could justify and say, "Oh, this is about divine law," it's so emphasized. I think that it's one of the anti-Semitic tropes coming back.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting. I have not traced this argument. Of pointing to the Jew as something more like an animal than a human being. But that would be an interesting thing to do. And if somebody were, if this was a class for credit and somebody wanted to write a paper, I would just see if you can find throughout history with this notion, because clearly I mean, when you think about Birkenau, right, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and you realize how the Jews were treated there, they were treated like animals. I mean, literally. I think you may have heard me. I don't know if you heard me before, but they came in cattle cars, and the barracks in which they lived were wooden, flimsy, not well insulated, and in the walls were little rings to tie up the horses. They were prefab horse barns. So the Jews come in cattle cars. They live in horse barns because they are, bottom line, animals. Okay, and if you're raised with that kind of an image, then the notion of slaughtering them is like, mowing down a herd of cattle. What's the difference? Okay, so I mean, the question is, I don't know personally the degree to which that motif. Now, I can tell you in the Middle Ages, and when we get to later Middle Ages, there are pictures of Jews suckling at the udder of a sow. Get that? Drinking the milk from a mother pig. Okay, these are literally cartoons that were put into books about, books, Bible stories, whatever, religious-oriented things. And the whole notion of the demonic Jew is part of this. But there you can see, this is 16th, 17th century. France, Germany, okay? And there it is. Who suckles from a pig? Someone who looks like a person, but ultimately is a pig. So there you can see it's popping up. What the chain of tradition on this is, I don't know for sure, so I can't make any comments. But yeah, I mean, this definitely could feed into that tradition. And I remind you, it was like in the 12th century, 13th century, that John Chrysostom became popular again. Okay, so yes, it's absolutely. All right, very good. All right, now somebody else can read. Thank you, Tybal. Third line from the bottom, last word. Another prophet. Waiting patiently.
I'll read.
Thank you, Cheryl. Go ahead.
Number 6.
Another prophet. Second.
Wait a minute. Sorry.
From the bottom, last word. Right above the 2.
I'm sorry. I'm not seeing another prophet. I see. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Drunkenness. Another prophet hinted at this when he said, Israel is as obstinate as a stubborn heifer.
That's Hosea chapter 4, verse 16. Go ahead.
And still another called the Jews an untamed calf.
Right, and that's Jeremiah 31:18.
Okay. Although such beasts are unfit for work, they are fit for killing.
Oh, go on.
And this is what happened to the Jews. While they were making themselves unfit for work, they grew fit for slaughter.
Okay, I mean, can you be more blunt than that? Okay, go ahead. This is why
Christ said, but as for these my enemies who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and slay them.
And that's Luke 19:27.
Did he really say that?
Was he aiming? Did he say this is the Jews? No, Jesus did not say that.
Enemies.
He said enemies, and the enemies could include Pharisees. Yes, Pharisees and scribes and priests and others. Okay, it was his enemies. It was a blanket statement. Generally the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, don't talk about the Jews, because these people who were came out of the Jewish tradition, and they're not going to, they know enough that this does not represent the entirety, and there were Jews who believed in Jesus. So they're not going to make a blanket statement like that. John, who's a pagan from birth, no Jewish roots, is the one who talks about the Jews. Okay, go ahead.
You Jews should have fasted then when drunkenness was doing those terrible things to you. Can you all hear the wind? Is it bothering you? You can't hear it? Okay.
No.
Jews should have fasted then when drunkenness was doing those terrible things to you, when your gluttony was giving birth to your ungodliness, not now. Now your fasting is untimely and an abomination. Who said so? Isaiah himself, when he called out in a loud voice. Well, Isaiah was a little before Jesus. I hate to point out to him. I did not choose this fast, says the Lord. Why? You quarrel and squabble when you fast and strike those subject to you with your fists.
All right, so this is Isaiah 58. We read this last night in the Amos class because he uses that line. No, it's not he, but it's this tradition of Jews who criticize the prophets, who criticize the Jews for their observing of ritual like sacrifices, fasting, and then go right ahead and do bad things. So that is a message from the Hebrew prophets. And here he's plucking this out and applying this, to the Jews. Okay?
Okay. He's bringing it home.
Yeah.
But if your fasting was an abomination when you were striking your fellow slaves, does it become acceptable now that you have slain your master? How could that be right?
Yes. Right. So it shows how ludicrous these people are. And so the bottom line was, again, speaking to his audience, I could see him say right afterwards, and it's not here, it's not included in this, but actually, it may be in the book. I just cut it off here. But the fact is, he would then be turning to the community and saying, so why do you people go to those synagogues? That was his whole line. Why do you want to go to there, these people, when they're fasting? They're fasting, they're making a mockery of everything. Why do you want to go to people who are like animals? Okay, and remember, there are other sermons where he says, God isn't there. There are a bunch of demons in there. They're the ones that make it appear to be holy, but it's not. Because they're under the control of the devil, and that's who the Jews really ultimately worship. And we saw in the book of John, chapter 8, that John actually says that you are of your father, the devil. So Chrysostom is on solid grounds when he says that. So here you go, okay? And again, in these cartoons from the early modern period, late Middle Ages, same thing. They're animals. They're dealing with animals. Sometimes they look like animals. They look like demons, and so forth. All right. We're now going to leave antiquity. And any comments, questions, et cetera, and so forth. And now we're going to move into the Middle Ages. Now we're going to begin by looking at St. Augustine of Hippo, who is 5th century. And Tybal has her hand up. Yes.
So, genealogists pay attention to names. Clearly, he wasn't born. It can't be serendipity that he was born with the name Golden Mouth.
No, that was because, no. That's a title he got because he was a very effective preacher.
But I was going to ask, did the church officially give him the title, or was it?
No. It's popular. It's a popular title. It is nothing. It's not an official religious statement. It's a fact of his. People had nicknames. That was his nickname. It was a noble nickname. So I'm sure people loved it. So he used it. It's like so and so the wise. Yes. You have Friedrich Barbarossa, Redbeard, and some people say Maccabee means hammerhead. He had a flat head. Okay, so the use of physical or skills, all kinds of things, defined nicknames by which a person was known. But for an orator to be called the Golden Mouth, that is a huge compliment. Okay, so that I guarantee you that he was proud of that one. Yeah. All right. So now, regarding Augustine of Hippo, you're going to see here in our reading, in our writing, what he has written, and what he and others who are based upon his thinking, which is what that first page is. There are certain principles, certain notions that he laid down. Augustine, I mean, I can't go over the whole biography, but in his younger years as a mature adult, he was a spiritually confused guy. He was groping. He became, for a while, a Manichaean, a mystic. In fact, he has a statement where he is talking about God having a spiritual body of light, a giant spiritual body of light. And that was something that he picked up from the Manichaean faith. When the Mani lived in the 3rd century CE, and by the time Augustine is dabbling in that, which would be the late 300s, early 400s, probably late 300s, he was very impressed with that mystical notion. The interesting thing is, and I raised this issue with a person who is an expert in the Jewish mysticism, if you read a Jewish work called the Shiur Koma, which means the measurements of Jesus' body, his height, but really his whole body. What's this talking about? There were mystics in the Talmudic period who wrote about great sages like Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Ishmael, others, who ascended up to heaven and witnessed things related to the divine and the divine court. And one of the traditions that they teach is that God actually had a body. It was a body of light, but it was visual. It was a human being up there could see it and not die, interestingly, and see its extent. And this book that was written by some mystic somewhere in the Talmudic period, and I can't pinpoint it. I don't think anybody can. It'd be anywhere from like 250 to 500, 600, somewhere in that period. So the point is, the example, so God has legs that are 20 million parsangs long. So parsang would be equivalent, I don't know, in measurement, but think of kilometers, okay, or think of, I don't know, meters or whatever, I don't know. But the point is, it's a measurement of distance of space. 20 million parsangs long. His arms are 10 million parsangs long. And they're talking about a body of light. And so I asked my friend, the expert on mysticism, did that guy get it from Manichaean teachings? He said, yes, it's more than likely that it was absorbed into these mystics from another mystical tradition close by, because the Manichaean tradition was operative in areas of Syria, the whole Middle East. It came from a guy, I believe Mani was Persian. I'm not sure. I think he was Persian. That's the original, the philosopher, the theologian who came up with these ideas, 3rd century. Anyhow, so I learned about that connection by reading something that Augustine wrote, where he refers to this giant body of God, which is luminous. Okay, so it's very interesting that not only did this touch Augustine, but it also touched a Jew or Jews who wrote this mystical, fantastic story of a God having this giant body. Okay, so it's not here, but that's Augustine. So he was groping. Finally, he plugged into what we would call serious Catholic Church-oriented teaching. But in the process, he was reading all kinds of things. And I don't know if he read Hebrew per se. He didn't have to, because by then, of course, you had the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And he began to read it. And he came to the realization that this is, the idea of there being value in understanding the plain meaning of the text of the Hebrew Bible rather than its interpreted meaning. He said it's important to understand the plain meaning as a foundation, because then you can see how brilliant the Christian theological interpretation was, and how the Christian minds of those who preceded him opened up the true, deeper spiritual meaning. But you don't have the spiritual meaning until you have the foundation of the written word. And who is it that is the keeper of the written word of the Hebrew Bible? Answer, Jews, the Jews. And so he says that's the purpose. Why are the Jews still here? Because it is in the plan, the master plan, that they have to be around. Because where we go, they go. And they bring their books. And they can teach people, make them aware of the basic meaning of the book better than we, because they know the Hebrew. But their problem is they're stuck at the plain meaning of the text, not the spiritual meaning of the text. And that's their problem. Because if they understood the spiritual meaning of the text, then they would become Christians, because they would realize how true the spiritual interpretation is. And this became a kind of a paradigm, because Augustine became a giant in church thinking. Okay, but now there is another issue that came up. So you can see there is a sense of respect that Augustine brings towards Jews and toward their book. I'm sure he knew nothing about Midrash or Talmud or stuff like that. That wasn't in his bailiwick. And I don't think there were Hebrew translations of the Aramaic, that would help him. And I don't know that he read Aramaic anyway. But he didn't live in the realm of Rabbinic Judaism that much. As opposed to somebody like Origen, we talked about this 3 weeks ago, who actually knew rabbis and was aware of certain midrashic traditions. So Augustine was not of that kind. But at the same time, the point though is that he knew that. He knew these things. All right? Okay. So now we're going to read, though, another piece of his understanding of the Jew. So on the one hand, you can see there is a sense of justifying tolerance of the Jew, right? Because they have this divinely ordained mission of bringing with them the word, the plain meaning of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible. So that's divinely ordained in his eyes. That's why they're there. Because all reason would have indicated they should have been wiped out by the Romans. They should have been wiped out, but they weren't. Okay? However, we're going to see in a minute, there's a whole other side to this, which also was to which the Christians after him were heir, which is a different perspective. And this, in fact, left within the church, and this you'll see how this echoes, a very ambivalent meaning of the Jew in the eye of knowledgeable Christians. I won't go into the popular ones. That's a whole, like today, right? Intelligent people can interpret something one way. The masses will pick up on some point and make that their reality, even though it is not a total reality. I guess that's part of human nature in certain respects. Okay, Barbara.
Just out of curiosity, you're talking about the two ways of dealing with the Bible, as the Christians put it. To us, don't we kind of take the literal side of what the Bible says more than changing it, like he was saying, which is the way I interpret what you're saying? What's our feeling about how do we feel about the Bible?
It depends upon what we are talking about.
I'm talking about
community.
Jews in general.
There's different gradations of it, okay? I think, an intelligent conservative Jew would there's a balance between the two, okay? All right, so we observe holidays with rituals that are not found in the Bible. right? And, this the Seder. All we know is it says in the Bible, teach your children. But the whole ritual of the Passover Seder is a rabbinic.
It's rabbinic. Yeah.
That's interpretation. Because we find that is a lot of meaning, right? So there's a lot of significance. The same thing with worship. What does the Bible talk about? What's the main ritual of worship in the Bible?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifices, animal sacrifices at the temple, exactly.
Which we don't do.
No, we can't. There's no temple.
That's because you can't. I know that.
Right. All right. So the point is, so today, for example, ask Rembaum, do you believe in the rebuilding of the temple? Should it be done? Because that is what we pray all the time.
All right.
My answer is no, I do not. And that's why I read the prayers that say we used to offer sacrifices. That's what our prayer books say. Some of them are a little bit closer to really literally saying, they sound like they're saying, let's rebuild the temple. So when they said that, I'm thinking, no, not that temple. We'll rebuild a giant building that all of the different streams of Judaism, there are different, a dozen different chapels, and you can choose and pick which one you want when you want, and we all live together in peace and harmony. That's the temple I'm talking about, right? And it can be built, right there in the middle of Jerusalem, and it'll be a wonderful thing bringing all the Jews in the world, and that will be something that will happen when the Mashiach comes, right? And it all fits together. Okay, so that's in my mind, that's what I think about. All right, but on the other hand, you have Orthodox Jews today who say it, I pray for the establishment of the sacrifices in the temple, because that's part of the God's plan when the Mashiach comes. Okay? And they believe in a literal Mashiach, a human being from the line of David who has the qualities that the Mashiach is supposed to have as laid out in rabbinic tradition, not in an organized fashion. You don't have a checklist. But if you pull from there and pull from here and pull from there and pull from here, you can create your own checklist. I've talked about this when I've actually spoken to Jews and to Christians about the Jewish concept of the Messiah. Anyhow, I personally don't want to see a king. I totally reject monarchy. I reject any kind of autonomous rule. I'm a democratic person. That's what I believe in. And I'm not going to compromise that. So if you want to find a guy who can prove that he is unquestionably from the line of David, and you want to say, okay, you are our symbolic, whatever, like the King of England. You shall be our king, honorific. And through you, we honor the tradition of the line of David, even though David wasn't such a guy worthy of all that honor if you read the Bible. Okay, anyway, so Barbara, on the other hand, you have Reform Jews, and I haven't memorized all their liturgy, because they offer, if you open up the prayer books today, it's great. There's a lot of Hebrew, which they didn't used to have 50 years ago, all kinds of things. And, I don't even know if they include references to the sacrifices, like in Musaf. Some of them don't even have Musaf, right? So, it's really played down. All of our prayers refer to them in the past tense. I'm perfectly comfortable with that, because that's part of our history. And I understand what sacrifice means, and done seriously, the Hebrew prophets notwithstanding, you're giving something of yourself, something precious, food, an animal you would eat, you're giving to God. Okay? So I understand that. Okay. My point is what I love about conservative Judaism is that it really is a blend of this notion of appreciating and studying seriously the plain meaning of the text, so I can get a better understanding of how people at different stages in the biblical period leading into the rabbinic period, how they understood monotheism, how they understood their Judaism. And I can see how things existed and they fell out and other things came to me. That's how you learn about the evolution of Judaism. I believe in evolution. That's part of the way the universe operates. Okay? I'm just thinking scientifically. Evolution is part of how the universe operates. Change.
But how would this guy that we were just talking about react to the way you and I feel about change and
How would Augustine?
you, yeah,
I don't
yeah,
know.
yeah, you don't know.
No, he
Okay.
was a conservative, small c. Once he accepted Christianity, and that was once he bought into it, he was a bishop. He was a giant. He was a churchman.
But from what we just read, would he think that we shouldn't have evolved, that they wouldn't want us around?
I can't answer your question because you're asking questions that he doesn't address.
Okay.
All right, he's not a Bible critic like today. He understood the Bible very well, but he had his own Torah on it, if you will. Okay? So anyway, that's the answer. All right? So yes, we appreciate both. You know me, when I teach Bible, I'm quick to talk about what it means in the context of the Israelite traditions at that time. A lot of it is very surprising, and I accept what archaeology and what a careful reading of the text teaches us as truth, our best image of what the truth is. I mean, somebody can come along tomorrow and discover something that categorically proves that the ark landed on the top of Mount Ararat. Okay? That has yet to happen. All right, Tybal, I see your hand. Just a quick aside here. I think this will brighten your day a little humor, but it's true. Okay? So there was, people are always trying to find physical proofs, especially people who are Christian fundamentalist readers of the Bible. Okay? So, Bible says that the ark ended up on the top of Mount Ararat. So this one guy publishes a picture. He says, this is a satellite image taken from the satellite looking down on Mount Ararat. And if you look closely, you will see there is an image that looks like this. You can see an outline of this on the top of Mount Ararat. What is that?
The ark.
The ark. It proves that Noah's ark was on the top of that mountain. If you dig on the top of that mountain, that's what you're going to find. And say, oh, really? One problem. The ark, in fact, is not shaped like that. That is how the ark is shaped. Read the Bible. There is no point on the tip of the ark. Why? It had no direction. You have a bow to cut through the water so you can proceed from point A to point B on the land, right? If you're going nowhere, you don't need the point. Well, where was the ark supposed to go? Nowhere. What was the purpose of the ark? To float with everybody aboard, keep everybody alive, and then where the ark finishes and lands, that's where it's going to be. But it's a rectangle. It's not pointed. That's the misuse of archaeology, of course, because it's not archaeology. Anyhow, that's a type of thing that it's humorous, and I like to share that because you see how the degree to which truly non-intellectual jumping the gun can lead you to misunderstandings. All right, Tybal.
So I thought you were going to go, if I can go back a little, in a different direction when you were talking personally about Third Temple. I thought you were going to go the metaphoric direction, as in when you said, no, that's not what you want. These are the prayers that speak to you. This was history. This is now. You don't see like the same way Zion and Jerusalem are not just physical places, but to me, they're symbols of what is most aspirational in Judaism.
I said that. I agree. That I said. I refer to the sacrifices as something that represent a certain meaning, and that is aspirational. On the other hand, I want to make clear that I don't want to see them reinstituted physically. So by saying it in the past tense, I validate their value as an expression of love of God and commitment to God. But at the same time, by having them in past tense, I'm saying I don't want them to replace prayer. That's not part of I don't have that same value because I'm not a farmer, I'm not a shepherd. That's not the culture in which I live. And frankly, I don't like the idea of killing animals and burning them. There's enough hunger in the world that if we're going to allow people to eat animals, let the people eat them. Okay? And especially since, once the temple was built and once the Josiah reforms came in, you could only bring sacrifices to the temple, right? At home, you can slaughter animals for your own purpose that wasn't sacrifices. So right away, it takes the process of slaughtering animals and blood and makes it a more mundane act. Okay, so that's even complicated in and of itself. So no, I think I agree with what you're saying. It's aspirational. And yes, I say, when you build this big synagogue with all of these different locations in it, it is aspirational. That's my notion. I would like there to be peace in Israel, peace among Jews, recognition of one another with all of our differences, which is we're nowhere near that now. And I said jokingly, that's when the Mashiach comes, that'll happen. Okay, I think it's important that we have aspirationally a messianic era where the things that the Messiah is supposed to do become a reality without necessarily having that person doing it. Let God oversee it in his own mysterious ways, working in conjunction with all of the human beings in the Jewish people to be able to make this happen. That's a miracle. And I mean that sort of tongue-in-cheek, but I also mean it. If that happens, that would be, to me, a sign that God has been a partner in that process. Okay, so yes, I see the metaphoric meaning. I just don't take it I bring it to a different level. Okay? So so I'm not in disagreement with you at all. It just depends how you want to carry the metaphor. Okay. All right. Now we're going to read about Augustine is going to tell, this is from his City of God. So City of God is really, it's based upon the concept of a Yerushalayim Shel Mala and a Yerushalayim Shel Mata, between the real Jerusalem and a spiritual Jerusalem. And the interesting thing is, in a sense, we do have that notion in Judaism in a different way. But it's like the same idea that, according to the Midrash, God had the Torah in hand, so to speak, before he created the world. And he wrote it down, and that was his Torah for creating the world. And that's what we are heir to, all right? And then so he gave it to us. I don't accept, obviously, from my perspective, this is Midrash. But the whole notion that there is this primordial ideal concept, even before now, it's interesting, that's Platonic, because Plato had this notion that the real realm of existence is an intellectual, spiritual one, and down here is a shadow of it. Okay, and the rabbis seem to have been influenced by it because Neoplatonism was rampant throughout the Middle East at the time that the rabbis were doing things. I'm talking, second, third, fourth, fifth centuries. Neoplatonism comes on the scene in the middle of the 3rd century BCE. And Plato was writing about that even before that. So, it looks as if that sort of filtered down into Judaism, the same way Aristotle filtered down into Rambam. So this filtered down into it was fascinating to them. And the notion, you can see the notion of that's the word I'm looking, not humanization, but the actualization of the word. All right, there's an Aramaic word in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in Rabbinic Aramaic, that means the word, and that is similar to what Platonic, the Neoplatonic notion of what the one, because it's Platonic. Neoplatonism is to many degrees monotheistic. Okay, so this concept of the word, which is a representation of the knowledge, of the divine knowledge, it's possible that the rabbis picked up on that from the Neoplatonists.
What is the word in Aramaic?
I'm trying to remember. It's not milta. There's another word for it, and I can't remember it right now. But there's definitely a word. When I get it.
We need vered.
What?
We need vered.
Yeah, vered. I don't know. This is Aramaic, though. I don't know if she knows it. She's biblical. This is not a biblical word. I mean, her vocabulary is terrific. But yeah, but I can find it out. It'll come to me. Not now. All right. Okay, so now let's read Augustine, seeing what he tells us about another element that is to be operative in how the church understands the Jewish people. Who's going to read? Errol, would you like to read?
Sure. I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it Hippo or Hypo?
Hippo.
Augustine of Hippo, 430 CE, City of God, Book 16, Chapter 35.
Yes.
Let us now see how the times of the City of God run on from this point among Abram's descendants. In the time from the first year of Isaac's life to the 70th, when his sons were born, the only memorable thing is that when he prayed God that his wife, who was barren, might bear, and the Lord granted what he sought, and she conceived, the twins leapt while she enclosed in her womb. And when she was troubled by this struggle and inquired of the Lord, she received this answer: 2 nations are in my womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from the bowels, and the people shall overcome the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. The Apostle Paul...
Stop. Hold on. So that, according to the Torah itself, what is the implication? This is something Rebecca learned from God, okay? So when it says the elder shall serve the younger, who's the elder? Esau.
Yeah,
Who's
Jacob.
the younger? Jacob.
Jacob.
Right, Yaakov, okay? So it means in the end that Jacob will dominate Esau. That could be actually, and he gets to this point at a certain time. By the way, Augustine figured this out himself, but it may be the plain meaning of the text is that it means that the Israelites would dominate the Edomites, who were traditionally the descendants of Esau. Edom, right? Adom, red hair, right? Red soup. Red is a color that's associated. Of course, later on it became associated with the Romans in the Jewish tradition, but that's something else. All right, anyhow, so, excuse me, so he mentions that there is this tradition that it refers to Isaac and Jacob, or Jacob and Isaac. That is correct, okay? And that's probably what it means, although in this case, it may also simply mean that the one who's going to be the bearer of the covenant is not going to be the oldest, but the youngest, because that will be the one the covenant will go from Abraham through Isaac to Jacob. And this is ultimately what happens, of course. Okay, so that's the other aspect. So again, 2 possible plain meanings. The notion of the transmission of the covenant versus plus or also the political dominance, which was sporadic, but nonetheless political dominance of Edom by the Israelites. That's realpolitik, shall we call it. Okay. All right. Is that clear? Okie doke. Now let's move on. Continue, Errol.
The Apostle Paul would have us understand this as a great instance of grace. For the children shall not yet born, neither having done any good or evil. The younger is chosen without any good desert, and the elder is rejected, when beyond doubt. As regards original sin, both were alike, and as regards actual sin, neither had any.
Right. Yeah, go ahead.
But the plan of the work on hand does not permit me to speak more fully of this matter now, and I've said much about it in other works.
Okay, stop there. All right. So Paul is suggesting that this actually, Paul was interested in the notion that this whole thing is an act of grace, right? In other words, God, it was a blessing from God, a gift from God, that the Isaac should take this role, and that the covenant from Abraham should be passed on through Isaac through to Jacob. Okay, that Jacob would ultimately be the bearer of that, and he becomes the founder of the children of Israel, right? That people. Who is Israel? Who's Israel?
Yaakov.
Yaakov. Israel is Jacob, right? His name was changed, right? So that's the same thing. So the point is, and out of that people comes Judah, his son, who is one of the two dominant sons of Jacob, right? And ultimately, who comes from the line of Judah? David. And ultimately then, who ends up at the end of that line of Judah? Jesus. So from his perspective, from Paul's perspective, right, it was a blessing, because that began the process, or continued the process, that ultimately brought Jesus into the world. And that's what he's talking about. That's what Augustine is talking about. But but he doesn't want to distract us, because he has something else to tell us. Okay, very good. Somebody else want to read, please?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Where does Islam fit into this? How
Nowhere.
their
Not
interpretation?
directly. No. Oh, hold on. No. The one common notion here, and I don't know if they actually picked that up from Augustine. Islam considers Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism, all those three religious groups, are the people of the book, because according to their tradition, Muhammad ruled, that Moses, the book of Jesus, and I'm not sure, I don't know his connections with Zoroastrianism, but from a philosophical, or shall we say theological perspective, that the word of Allah resonated in all three, and in their writings, because the common denominator was they all had sacred books in which one could find their interpretations of the Bible, of the Word of God. Okay, and most powerfully, if you read the Quran, of course, is Moses. Moses is mentioned, that name is found more frequently in the Quran than any other name. Muhammad's name is only mentioned 4 times. And it's almost as if he's too sacred to mention his name, which is like the Jewish tradition, right? But he's called the teacher, he's called the prophet, right? But only 4 times, if my source on this, which I read a while ago, is correct. I didn't go through the whole Quran and count, but there are people who've done it. So Muhammad is 4 times, Moshe is over 150, and Jesus is mentioned as a prophet over 30 times. So clearly Musa is a dominant force. The whole point is that according to the Quran, according to Muhammad, he brought the true meaning of the teaching of Moses, whereas the Jews got screwed up with some bad texts, and because of the destruction of the temple and all of the, what happened afterwards and things, people came back like Ezra. He mentions Ezra. Ezra is mentioned as a person who was involved in the process of putting it all back together after they came back from exile. But he says in the process, it got fouled up. And Muhammad, the prophet, was the only one who actually was working with the original pure meaning of the revelation to Moses. Okay, but the point is, common denominator, and there's a whole other level of this, which was pragmatics. Because in the early generations after the Islamic conquest of the Middle East, there were Jews and Zoroastrians in all the areas that they conquered who were part of the community and who had skills that the Muslims did not bring with them in terms of organizing around a people, right? Because the Muslims, I mean, they created a problem from themselves. They created an empire that stretched from India to Spain. So what do you have to do to make the empire work? You've got to empower people who know how to deal with governments, right? Not just our merchants. Okay, so Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians in many of these areas had worked their way into elements of the governing process, especially in the Persian world, where Jews were treated pretty well at that point. And so were Zoroastrians, because Zoroastrianism was the religion of Iran until the Muslims, basically it just shifted over afterwards. But the point is, so there was a pragmatic element. Now, later on, of course, once it took a couple of generations after Muhammad, after the conquests, but then they began to realize that if these people are given too much authority, they could weaken the authority of the Muslims. And by that time, they began to have their act together. So therefore, we will see when we get to Islamic traditions, there is this thing called the Pact of Umar, which developed around 700, which defines and limits the rights of these people. Okay? So, but it corrected itself pretty quickly. But anyway, the point is, so these were the people of the book. And it's very interesting. And again, I don't know if Muhammad picked this up from Christians, because he's around 200 years after Augustine. And Augustine's teachings had already begun to be absorbed into Christian traditions by the time Muhammad comes along. And it's very possible that this notion of bringing the book, because he basically says the Jews are the people, he'll define them as the people of the book. Okay? And so it may be that it began with him, but I cannot draw any conclusions because I don't know the degree to which this actually influenced Muhammad. Okay, but that answers your question, right?
It does, but doesn't Ishmael fit into this?
No. No, because once you get beyond him, his role in the evolution. Remember, the Bible says nothing about the existence of Arabs as descendants of Ishmael. I mean, there's an allusion when you go through genealogies of names, people who gave birth to so-and-so, gave birth to. There is a whole listing of the genealogies of Ishmael. But go plug it into real Arab history. No, it's very hypothetical. Okay? And so there's no direct connection made, and there's no evidence of the only time to see the Ishmaelites active, really, as far as I know, is when Joseph is carried off to Egypt. I mean, after that, you don't hear about the enemies of Israel during the kingship, the kingdom, right? From when? 1000 to 586 BCE. They are the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Philistines, the Arameans, okay, then the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the Egyptians. I mean, these are the people with whom the kings of Israel and Judah had to deal with, either making treaties, fighting against, controlling, losing control, blah, 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 okay? Ishmaelites you don't see in the picture at all, as far as I know. So that's the answer. Okay. All right, before we move on. All right, Tybal and then Barbara.
Because you were talking about the genealogy of Jesus Christ is found in the New Testament. I teach genealogy, and it's always interesting to me when I go hear others teach, and you may know that Mormon Latter-day Saints, it's really part of the religion, and that is often used as an example by Mormon teachers of how not to do genealogy. Because what you're supposed to do is start with the most known, which would be the best records, the most contemporaneous, and work its way back. And that starts with the the line of Jesse and David and works its way down. So I just thought I'd give you that genealogical fun fact about the New Testament.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. But in point of fact, there's a major genealogical problem, right?
Yeah, that he wasn't biologically, I mean, if you accept that he was not the son, that he was not.
He was not the son of Joseph.
Right, exactly.
Son of God who inseminated Mary,
Sure.
the Holy Spirit, right? Not Joseph. So, and that was an issue the Jews raised in the early centuries, right? How can you call him the Messiah? Okay. Because he's the son of God. Can't have it both ways. And in truth, the messianic issue is sort of sidelined because the Jews would argue, show us that he was the Messiah. And that's why the whole concept of the second coming came around, because Jesus had not shown the signs of the Messiah. And so they say, wait until he comes back, then you'll see the Messiah. And the Jews say, show me where it says he's coming a second time. The only group who believe the Messiah comes twice is Chabad. Okay. Anyhow. All right. Anyway, so that's the point here. But what happened was, obviously, the notion of Jesus as Son of God, which was part of what the Gospels do say, that was immediate and present. And it had to be, because according to their teaching, as Paul ultimately articulates first, that this is the notion of the sin of Adam, right? And remember, Paul predates the Gospel writers, right? Paul is 50s and 60s CE. And that's having written down things in his letters. That's what we have. Most of them are authentically Paul. Some are not. And you got the book of Acts that was put together later, talking about Paul and what he did. Okay. So the actual Gospels as written already you can see elements of Paul's teaching within the teachings of the Gospel writers, right? Because they came after Paul. All right, so Paul is the one who really develops this notion of original sin and the concept of why did Jesus die? Because he had to, and that's why he had to be man and God, because as a sacrifice, he has to be a sacrifice that somehow reflects the people whom his sacrifice is supposed to save, which are human beings. So God had to become incarnate in him to allow for that to happen. On the other hand, because he's the Son of God, so he's got this whole spiritual side to him, and the same with the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, right? That's part of that spiritual expression. And eventually, there were 2, then 3 elements in what they call the unity of the Trinity. Okay. Anyway. Okay. All right, Barbara.
Okay. You're talking about the people of the book, and when the synagogue group was in the Balkans this past summer, we spent an evening with a group of 6 Arabs, 2 of whom were imam. We first had a discussion before dinner. We had dinner with them with 1 at each table, and then further discussion, questions and answers from both sides. We also saw how they daven their evening prayer, and then we davened our evening prayer. It was actually quite a difference because they're very quiet about it. The imam does most of the talking, and the other people mumbled. Right. Then we get up and we're all singing, the whole group. It's a very vocal thing like we do. But anyway, the reason that what I wanted to say, I think people will find interesting. I've always wondered why halal is not kosher for us. And so having the opportunity to have this really nice man, a professor at the university there in Bosnia, talking with us, and nothing was sacred. We could really discuss anything with him and him with us. So I asked him, what is halal? Why is halal not something that we can eat? So he said, and I said, what is halal? So he said, halal is foods that have been cut by people of the book. I mean, you just brought up that statement, and right. I found that to be an amazing statement. And so I said, well, who are people of the book? And he said it was the Muslims, the Jews, and the Christians. I said, but Christians don't don't cut their meat the way like we do, where we have a special person, special knives, and special way of doing it, which I think is similar to your way. He said, you're right, your way is similar to our way, but we still believe in the idea of the people of the book. So if a piece of meat has been cut by a Christian, which most meats are in the butcher shops, we are allowed to eat it. So I said, I said, well, what's the difference then between halal? And then I started realizing kosher is cut pretty much the same way as halal is cut. Only we demand that it be cut by the specific person who has to cut it with a knife, and it's only done by a Jew. Whereas halal, it can be by any of the three religions, the cutting of the meat.
Right.
And I thought that was just an amazing, enlightening thing for me. And probably for many people.
I would say, right. And I don't know all the differences. I've never studied halal. But, if you follow kashrut closely, it's not just that it's a Jew who's properly trained.
Well, that's what I meant,
Proper equipment, because the knife can have no nicks in it because it's got to be a clean cut.
Exactly.
Right? And that's for a couple of reasons, but the primary reason is because the sacrifices that you were supposed to offer in the temple had to be meat that is totally unblemished. And the rabbis interpret it to mean that when you kosher a piece of meat, when you slaughter an animal, there should be no blemishes, which means skin or flesh that was cut improperly, that becomes a blemish. And that's why you have to have a specialist do it. And the specialist has to be an observant Jew who understands the whole system.
Okay? Right, and had been trained by a previous one.
Exactly. Yes, specifically trained, exactly. And the second notion that pops up with this, now remember, because that's based upon how you did a sacrifice. Remember that the eating of kosher meat, according to Deuteronomy, means you cut it, and the rabbis interpreted it the same way you would cut a sacrifice. Get the blood out, except instead of putting it on the altar, right? You
pour it on the floor.
Pour it on the ground. You dump it on the ground, right? Not on the floor, but on the ground, or the
ground.
Right, yeah. So the point is, it's based on the concept of the sacrifice, all right? And that's interesting, because there again you can see, based on what we talked about before with Tybal and all that, there is a certain sense that you are perpetuating the notion that how you eat has to be a sacred act, and it has to be governed by sanctity. And this is one of the definitions of the sanctity. But there's a second piece of this that popped up later, which is tsar balei chayim, which means causing pain to an animal. And the fact is that a well-done cut by an expert, and that's the key thing, it's cut so quickly, it's like when you cut yourself with a razor. The blood comes out, and then a few seconds later, you start to feel the pain. But initially, the shock to that moment dulls it. And they have actually done studies on this thing, because they can tell if the animal suffers if they start to moan, right? And the fact is, when a shechting is done properly, the blood flows away from the brain. Within 10 seconds, they are totally unconscious, and there's no pain.
It's the same thing as if a person gets their neck sliced and you cut the carotid, you're gone just in a few seconds.
Exactly, that's right, because the blood,
exactly the same
and
thing.
It's not that you're dead, because the body keeps pumping, and that's the point. That's why animals now, they're in pens and they tilt them, and the pens today. I'm off topic here, but this whole notion of avoiding the pain, one of the big issues that has come up in slaughterhouses in certain places, won't go into details, is that when you walk in there and they're slaughtering these animals, this is kosher slaughtering, you hear mooing a lot, which means something that's going on is inflicting pain on the animal. That could be the old thing of shackling and heisting, which is what they used to do, because you got to get the animal vertical to some degree, the blood comes out.
Right.
Okay, and that's the whole point. So they, up until about 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was done by taking the animal, tying them up, hanging them, cutting them. In the meantime, while they're hanging, what are they doing? In pain. So since that sensitivity emerged within the last few decades, they defined pens, and ultimately Temple Grandin, who's the expert in how you deal with cattle, right? She came into kosher slaughter places and showed them how to design a pen that you can put the animal in, tilt it properly, shech the animal, it's enough of an angle, the blood comes out, everybody's happy, and the animal hasn't suffered. And it is now in this country, that's generally how it's done.
Oh.
Okay? And I actually talked to her about this. There was a point that there was a butcher shop in this town a lot of people used, and that person bought meat from a place from this agri-processors out in Iowa. And it turned out that PETA, right? PETA, the organization that looks after animals and such, they sent in some spies, and they took videos, and they showed the most horrific thing. There was one animal that was cut, and they opened up the cage, and he got out and was walking around, a cow, in the area there, and then fell down. That was a total failure. Plus, you walk into that place and you hear this moaning. The cows are they're bellowing because they're in pain. And that was one of the factors that caught Temple Grandin's eye. And the whole point of kashrut being a way of avoiding pain was totally being nullified in that place. And it was the largest meat processor in the country. So they shut it down. The OU, thank God, got in touch with her. She then brought them in and explained how this should be done. And from that point on, the whole kashrut system in this country shifted over to a relatively painless process. Okay, so that's an example, though, of how our system is different from the halal. That's why we can't eat halal. I don't think they have that kind of at least I'm not familiar with it.
Well,
but
apparently it's somewhat similar.
Yeah, but the fact there's no question they will eat kosher meat. In fact, I remember at the little strip mall on the corner of La Cienega and Olympic, right? So there's a what do you call it? A 7-Eleven store, and they used to have kosher sandwiches. And for a year or two, it was kosher and halal on the same sticker. They had printed stickers with both approvals on it. Both. Fascinating, huh? Yeah. All right, Margaret, and then Tybal, and then we're going to close.
I just wanted to get a clarification. Did you say that the concept of avoiding pain was an original motivator behind the rules?
No. I said the original motivation was the sacrificial cult.
Okay.
How sacrifices were to be offered, because that defined sacred cutting. Right?
But what about the rule, for example, that you can't take a limb from a living animal?
That's different. You're right. That is rabbinic. It is not mentioned in the Bible, but if you read the permission that in chapter 9 of Genesis, we read it last night. Chapter 9 of Genesis, was it? I think it was whenever. Okay. No, I'm sorry. That was Monday night with another class. Pardon me, I get confused among all my classes. Okay. Anyway, so we were talking about this in another class on Monday night. So in chapter 9 of Genesis, it says, you may eat the animal, but you may not take its blood b'nafsho. And that term, it means with his spirit. And the implication there is that you cannot, the rabbis interpreted that to mean that you cannot tear off meat from an animal while its spirit is still in it. And they interpret that to mean what you just said. So therefore, a no-no in dealing with animals is called Ever min hachai, which means pulling a limb off of a living animal, which is absolutely forbidden. So if you go into a Japanese restaurant and you like fresh sashimi, and they pull a little small fish, whatever, out of the tank while it's alive, and cut off a slab and cut it up for you for your sashimi, because it's fresh, can't eat it because it's tearing a limb from a living animal. So the whole notion flowed out of that passage in Genesis through the rabbinic teaching, and therefore when you talk about the covenant with Noah, remember God, according to the rabbis, made a covenant with Noah, 7 basic principles, foundational principles that govern human behavior. I won't go through all of them with you now, but the rabbis interpreted things that way. And the Ever min hachai, the ripping a limb or any kind of flesh from a living animal, the rabbis said Noahides, meaning all people on the face of the earth, if they really want to act out and take seriously their covenant with the one God, which they are invited to do, right? Because according to the rabbis, that's the rule now. Okay? Everybody on earth should be worshiping the one God, and their obligation is to do 7 basic things. One of them is don't tear flesh from a living animal. And of course, if it's forbidden, and that's every human being, Jew and non-Jew. Okay, so it's a rabbinic notion, and it's very humane. It sort of sets the groundwork for the later concept, and I have not traced the development. When was this pain issue in general first brought forth in the rabbinic tradition? I can't answer that. It's not perfectly clear. Okay, but the Ever min hachai is very clear in the rabbinic tradition. You're not allowed to do that, and that is a rule for every human being on earth. Got it?
Every being, not human being, but being.
No, the animals are not supposed to kill people. They can kill other animals. In Genesis 9, it says animals, if an animal kills a person, kill it. He's a murderer. But an animal can kill another animal. It happens all the time in the wild. And that killing, the point is, that's for eating, right? But that's animals. They're not obligated for mitzvot. Okay? All right, so Margaret answers your question?
You said thank you.
Okay. I didn't hear it. All right.
No, it was on the chat.
Oh, okay. I see it. Yes. I got it. Okay. Tybal.
I just wanted to say, as a longtime reader of Temple Grandin, the difference between positive and negative mitzvot, she made it positive. It's not just that they didn't suffer fear, but the way she designed the circling tunnels that they go, they were actually, comfort may be too strong, but it was something that was designed with familiarity and a knowledge of bovine psychology. So do you know what I'm saying? It went so much further. I'll do the positive negative thing again. It was a positive mitzvah, not just the negative, don't cause them pain.
But you know how she sold it? You're right. But you know how she sold it? Because she showed them how if you set up, this is in terms of how you move cattle in the stockyards, right? That's what this is all about. How do you move cattle? Because they have to go through certain procedures before they can be slaughtered. Okay, they have to be washed, they have to be this and whatever. I'm not an expert on all of them. But the whole point was that you have to move, they have to be moved, and all of this equipment has to be designed in a way that it takes into account the needs of the animal to avoid any pain or discomfort. Okay, that was her principle. But the way that she sold it to the meat packers was very pragmatic. She said, because if they are happy and at peace, then you're going to have fewer instances of animals who bring pain and actually cut themselves on elements of the like on the gates, on the whatever the inside of the yard would be like, banging into it one another. Okay, but also they have horns, and if they get emotional, out of control, and start moving those horns around, what do they do to the other cows? They cut them, they puncture them, and it causes more pain and more noise, and also allows for the introduction of diseases and all kinds of infections into these animals. And if you want to have your animals, the meat and the chemistry of the meat, as well as the physical presence of the meat, to be something that you can sell, you want it to be as clean and as wholesome as possible. And they bought that principle. And he said, in the end, you're going to save money because you're not going to have to deal with animals that you couldn't slaughter. You're not going to have to clean up the mess, whatever. She laid it all out to them. And so it wasn't just the ideology behind it. It was also the pragmatics. Okay. And again, that's a factor that ultimately enters into all kinds of religious decisions, even though they may not be explicit in what is written, they might be implicit. So there's often very pragmatic things that stand behind religious practices. Anyhow, and by the way, the secular slaughterhouses are not interested in religious practices, but this notion of keeping the animals happy, to keep their costs down, plain and simple. And she sold it. Good for her.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.